It's good to quote see all of you again. This is our session 6 of Nuts and Bolts, and I'm going to just share a screen here to get us started. Welcome to session 6, our final session of Nuts and Bolts. I thought as we were winding up the course, I should go back and talk a little bit about what we talked about in the first session of the course, that we told you this was not about theory, it was about doing. And it's about planning and executing new ventures, and that includes any kind of new venture. And the goal was to get you excited and infect you with this lifetime incurable disease that's a very healthy type of virus. So hopefully we've done that. We promised you back at the beginning that you were going to invest, if you invested 6 evenings in the course, you'd be able to get new or enhanced skills in things like, how do you evaluate a venture idea from its impact and economic viewpoint? And I think some of the combination of Bob's discussion about customers and Charlie's discussion about financial projections gave you an idea of how to look at those kind of things. How do you figure out who is a customer and who wants what I have? Bob Jones's presentation on finding your customer is a very unique one. You don't see it very often. It's very impactful. It's been used in a variety of places, and it has really helped focus people in. So hopefully you got something out of that. Where and how do I get financial resources to launch and grow my venture? Julianne Zimmerman, in the last session, gave us a really good presentation on that. There are, of course, other resources that she didn't cover, but she hit most of them and focused on more of thinking about where do you want to go as an entrepreneur and what kind of resources really should be the guiding post of where you're going to look, because the financial sources range all over the place with what they require and what they expect. We asked, how do I scale my venture and make it sustainable? Well, we didn't talk specifically about that, but if you think about the discussion around business model, when Rich Kibble was here, understanding, how are you going to really take it fully to market? What's it going to look like? Charlie Tillett helped you figure out how to model it 4 or 5 years out, and that's the idea of that's where you want to be from a business model. And I think the discussions and the founders and the people things, you also get insights into what was required to build a team to scale. So hopefully the pieces of that are there. And how do I build and retain a top-notch team, employees and advisors? The people session was a really, really good one on that. I think Habib did a really nice job with this panel. And you don't realize that he put that together, in virtually 24 hours. So how do I negotiate deals and resolve team conflicts? Well, we had a great session with Mindy Garber on that. Hopefully you learned something there. What are the legal pitfalls? I sort of hit you with a fire hose on that one night. Things you need to think about and be aware of. And then how do I pitch my venture idea? Bob Jones came back and talked about pitching in general. And if there's one thing that we didn't really fit into this course because of the breakout sessions we had to try to do team building, is we didn't do as many individual pitches as I was envisioning. So we'll have to fix that in future years. So those are the things we said you would get if you took the course, and hopefully you agree that we at least touched on those and given you more insights. Now, before we get too far into tonight's topic, I just wanted to cover the writing requirement for those who are taking the course for credit. There is a requirement. You either have to do an executive summary of a plan, 2 to 3 pages, or a pitch deck. There's, at the bottom of the slide is the link to the nutsandbolts.mit.edu website, the writing requirements page that explains that in more detail. As you put together either an executive summary or a pitch deck, recall the 3 whys that I presented in the first episode. You want people who are reading or getting the pitch to be able to understand why this, why is what you're proposing something that's important. Why are you doing it? Why should they care? And then why now? You know, why should we do this now? Why is this the right time? Are we too early, too late? And then why this team? For you at this stage of your development, the team part, you know, you don't have serial entrepreneurs on the team quite yet, but the idea is to come through with the fact that you understand what you have and why you're the best people to take it from here forward, and perhaps attract other team members. Now, the due date is midnight, Saturday, January 30. If you submit your work on the canvas.mit.edu website, because of teams, there will be several of you on each of the plans. So there are two ways you could handle this. One is each of you submit a plan through the assignment part of that. In any event, you should include on the plan or the pitch deck your full name and student ID. And the reason for that is when we get the grading sheet from the registrar, they'll have your formal name and not your nickname. And often it's hard to connect those two. And there's always somebody who doesn't get credit for the course because we can't figure out who it is. So make sure you fully document that. So either if there are three of you on the team, you could each submit it in your individual assignments. Or if you want to save us a little work, have one of you submit it and the other two just submit a one-page thing saying, I'm on team X with, you know, these other two people. That way we won't be sorting through 140 different things. If we have 140 for credit. So if you have questions about any of this, please contact the TAs at nutsandbolts-ta@mit.edu. So that brings us to tonight. In a normal real-world experience, we would have had Yonald Chery come in tonight and talk about the virtual ink story. In the first session, I played a little video of the product, and you got an idea of what it was about. Yonald is not going to be able to make it tonight, so what we're going to do instead is we're going to look at a prior video of his presentation. It's not the best, but it's the best we could do in the circumstances. And we'll do it's about an hour and 30 minutes or so. About halfway through, we'll take a bio break and do the remainder. And then after that, I thought we could have a general, we won't have breakouts tonight because, you know, teams better have been formed if you have to get your assignment in by Saturday. So we'll do just a simple bio break in the middle. And after Yonald's presentation, I thought we could have a general Q&A for people who had any kind of question relating to new venture formation. And I'm happy to stay and talk about that. And so with all of that in mind, let me see if I can get this video link to work.
I'm pleased tonight to be able to introduce to you, in some sense, Yonald Chery is the first MIT person I ever met. As a pre-Frosh, we connected when he was out doing his undergrad 6A studies at Hewlett-Packard in Silicon Valley. All right, we mind melded then. We worked together when I was a freshman. He had already been here for a year. So I've known this person for a long time. And I've also engaged with his creative mind for a long time. And this is what I'm delighted to essentially expose you to all, is to give you a sense of like, look, here we have an inventive and entrepreneurial person who's done it multiple times. And he'll touch on some of those. But he's going to go deep in a live case study, a case study that we engaged with very richly here. And it's towards that end that we've given you the virtual ink, the original document. We've talked about it over the course of this past 2 weeks. And we're going to give it over to Yonald to tell you what actually happened. And he's going to do it in such a way that it's not merely a sort of forensic, dissection of sort of, I don't know, triage, trauma. But he's going to say, all right, here's what I've learned from this, and what he hopes you all will absorb and not do, as well as do, because you did a lot of things right. Yonald Chery. Cheers.
All right. We hadn't known each other for a long time. Thank you for the introduction. I am actually really thrilled to be here, and this is, I think, the 21st year that I've come back and gave a variation of this talk. And I moved out of the area about 10 years ago, but I used to attend every lecture and would do this after the speakers would talk about various topics to try to connect right away. So I'm going to try to pack in as much as I can. Whoops, we need to switch presentations. Just realized, excuse me. Get to do my own IT work here. There we go. And every year the audience is a little different, so I'm going to want to understand a bit about you at first, but I wanted to frame sort of why I do this, because MIT is a fantastic place, and there are lots of incredibly successful CEOs and all sorts of folks who come and talk at MIT and tell you these just great stories of success of how they started, and things just went awesome, right? And my concern is that's not the norm. And even if it is going great, don't assume that that's your outcome either, right? Things are called unicorns in the investment community for a reason. They're really, really rare, right? And so in that sense, I want to give you another point of view to really ground your thinking about stuff related to entrepreneurship. I want basically for everyone to leave this class feeling, yeah, I could do this. And I want you to all enter the competition, each and every one of you. This year, next year, as many times as possible. And Joost gave you a preview. I entered a couple times before I actually got the business that made sense for me and a team and the dynamic at the time to launch. True to the MIT motto of mens et manus, as Joost mentioned, the theory you've done in the last few classes, I'm going to try to couple with stories about experience. So I'm a storyteller by nature. I don't really sort of lecture programmatically. So again, what I thought would happen, what happened, what I do differently, those kinds of lessons learned, and I try to appeal to the audience. So to that sense, first of all, because I do get emails after the class, and everyone takes, for some reason, the Virtual Link Executive Summary of Business Plan as the template to write for the competition. Don't do that. We disclose that mainly to just show, here's an example, a point in time of someone who did so, and for you to sort of understand, well, does that make sense or not, right? So there are good things in some of that document. There are things that were ridiculous in both of those documents. And the point was, some of the previous lecturers went through that and ripped apart the financials, or perhaps part of the executive summary, so I'm not going to dwell on that. And a business plan itself is not the only thing, right? It's basically beginning to frame your mind, wrap your mind around what the problem is, so that you can start to bring some discipline to your thinking about your venture. So first off, I sat where you were sitting 22 years ago, okay? No, actually 24 years ago, right? My next business was started with someone who sat where you're sitting. All right. What's that? It was over here. No, that was my first business. Oh no, you're right. Over there. You're right. It was over there. My current business partner, who was in this class 11 years ago, is sitting where the gentleman is hiding underneath that really bright light where I can't see him. Okay. This class, believe it or not, you are sitting around people who will be resources and colleagues that you won't have any understanding as you peer into the future that this may come back to haunt you in a positive way, right? And I love getting emails from people. In fact, I had lunch with someone today who wrote me and said, I was in the class last year and I took your advice, I quit my job, I started my business, so you won't believe how awesome it is. Now, I don't want to sound like an infomercial, not everyone should do that. Don't quit graduate school or do anything insane. Although it seems that a lot of MIT grads work for Harvard dropouts. I don't know why that's the case. But my point is, I really want to get you excited about entrepreneurship with some honest sense of what can happen. So my background was I was undergrad and master's in electrical engineering and computer science, and I left near the tail end of my PhD. It was within sight, right? I could see the bright light. It wasn't an oncoming train. I was almost done. And I left to go start my first company. I worked in industry for a little bit, HP Medical, HP Labs on the West Coast, where I first met Yost, Motorola, and I spent, believe it or not, I went from being an entrepreneur to actually being asked to serve for the Department of Defense to work on innovation issues for a number of years. So imagine that, going from being an entrepreneur where you can do anything with maximum freedom to the most organization in the world in terms of bureaucracy. I founded a number of companies. I have advised scores and scores of companies over the years. And I've started companies, I've angel invested in companies, I've helped, pick for our current portfolio. Yost mentioned at the beginning, my current role is a CTO for essentially what is a cybersecurity incubator located in Maryland. And we actually are offering a fairly large prize with an upcoming contest. So if any of you happen to be interested in cybersecurity or big data management or analytics of that sort, there'll be an announcement about a massive prize, well, an opportunity for a massive prize if you have any ideas in that space. So that's a bit about me, okay? I sat where you are, and a lot of fun stuff happened afterwards, all right? So I want to get to know quickly a little bit about you, and I'm going to run through some of these because I always find it interesting when I go up from venue to venue what people are like and what they're doing. So how many of you are grad students? How many undergrads? Okay, a few, all right. School of Science, School of Engineering, School of Business, yeah, okay. Any other school that I didn't quite hit? School of Architecture, School of, okay. Public Administration. Okay, all right, good. And I presume you all have a new business idea of some sort or thinking about it, right? No? I should see more hands up than that. Okay, all right. How many have always started a business? That's got something underway. Okay, a handful, sorry. I expect some questions there. And I presume some of you have worked on business plans thus far? Executive summaries, good, all right, so you've been suffering with that pain. How many of you have raised funding already or have some paying customers for what you're doing? Wow, okay, that's usually not, I don't see many of those. How many of you invest in businesses? Oh, good, because we're going to talk about them. Okay. How many of you have served in the US military? Very interesting. So when I give this talk in DC, almost 2/3 of the hands go up, which is really interesting, as I understand the different demographics.
How about all military anywhere?
What's that?
How about any military anywhere?
How about any military service anywhere? Interesting. Okay, great. How many of you are, and this is, again, not intended to be political, I'm just collecting data. How many of you are first or second generation immigrants? Very interesting. I'm one as well, right? How many of you are married, have children, have family, have other dependents who are depending on you, which add a level of risk that you're like, what the heck am I doing thinking about starting a business? Okay. All right. And how many have taken this class before? Yeah. Yeah. So the reality is, if you are here for a couple of years, you may want to come back because lessons that you're going to start to learn the second time around as you launch your venture will begin to sink in. And frankly, the questions and the people that come to the class, you'll be able to ask very targeted questions and get a lot more help. All right. So you were introduced to the concept of what Virtual Link was doing, right? And I wanted to motivate what the problem was. And there were really two problems. When I was in graduate school, I was a teaching assistant for a class called 6111. 6111 was an institute lab where for the first 6 weeks of the class, we teach students principles of basic digital systems design. You might have seen them. They used to carry these briefcases that they couldn't get through TSA today, but they were all sort of filled with wires and electronic components and so on. And it was all done with older logic, so there's definitely no way you'd be able to board a plane looking at with that. And The problem was, because it was a digital systems class, anything that had to do with audio or video or anything in the real-time domain outside of the digital systems, the students really didn't have a lot of experience and we didn't cover it. And the students had to come to the TAs for help. So as teaching assistants, we would go to the board, we would help them with whatever the interface logic and circuitry would be, right? So it's a lot of non-textual technical graphics on a board. And they would be furiously copying it down. And that was the first mistake. They're not listening to me as the instructor, trying to communicate the core idea of what it is that they need to be able to do so that they can finish the primary part of their project. Second part was they make a mistake in transcribing some sort of schematic component, right? And being that the major portion of their grade was demonstrating an operational final project, often as many as a third to a half, depending on the year, the final projects didn't work because of some error in communication there. And I thought, this is such an easy problem to fix. If I can just get the notes off the board and into people's hands so that they can listen to me and understand and ask questions and not worry about the note-taking part, I could reduce the errors significantly. And people's projects would finally work and have a great experience. Because for me, 6111 was the course where I had the aha of being an engineer. I flipped the switch and everything worked, and I was like, yeah, right? I knew it was really exciting. So that was the motivation for that. And I said, now this was my first mistake though, is I was sitting I came to the class a little late, and I'd submitted being trained as an MIT engineer. I wrote up my business plan as an IEEE transactions memo sort of format in LaTeX, and it read transcription system, and I described it technically and all the features and how it would possibly work and so on. And they were, that in itself was not enough, right? The fact that you can build it didn't really matter because that was just an aspect of the entire venture that was expected during the competition. So my first reaction was, sort of the mad scientist from the movies, they don't understand me at the Institute, they're all fools, that kind of thing, right? But I took it to heart because I had a classmate come back to Sloan, Mike Dixon, and he was coming back because he had worked out in industry a number of years and wanted to start a business and was asking me for ideas. So we talked about half a dozen different ideas that I had for various technical things that make products over a couple beers at the then Thirsty Ear pub. Is that still around? Yes. All right, good. I used to run the Thirsty Ear. Good. And Mike says, that pen thing's really interesting. And it appealed to him on an emotional level because he could understand in the same way that I was passionate about that problem and fixing it so that folks could have a really good educational experience. Okay? So we said, all right, let's do that. And then we entered and we won. No, it wasn't just that easy. All right? So I don't know, is it still? No, it's 100K now, right? Back then it was 50K, and before that it was like 50 cents, I don't remember. This was me. I tell this part, this is the only photograph unfortunately I have, but this is my dorm room in old Ashdown House that was, 9 by 10. And during the day, I had a futon. We'd moved all my other furniture out. So I'd work in my lab during the day. I'd roll out my futon at night when I come in to sleep. And there'd be literally 4 other people at 4 other desks working at stuff, people building stuff. Those little trays had all sorts of integrated circuit components. I tend to walk around barefoot at home, and I don't know if you ever walk on the old integrated circuits. It's like stepping on Lego in the middle of the night for you if you have kids. It's really frustrating. But the business was literally launched in my dorm room. And we'd have meetings with business partners in the lounge down the way, and they'd be sort of confused that they're actually meeting at an MIT dorm room and wondering, are these guys serious? But we were serious about getting it done. I think we ended up appropriating this bench because it was left in the hallway by some lab. So that was a lot of fun. And then this is so 6111, this is what you actually built your final projects on. And so I actually used the class materials to prototype the main thing. And of course today, all of this would be done in software, which is just kind of crazy. And you saw the demo. Basically, the idea is to create a digital writing surface by basically tracking the motion of the stylus rather than making an active or responsive surface in some way, right? So we were getting literally 300, 400 DPI over a board this size I could write my name essentially illegibly on the board and then change the pen width, and it was just really fantastic stuff and really great engineering fun. So since you saw the video on all of this, correct? So you get the sense of it and you're like, why don't you just use your cell phone? Well, there were no cell phones with cameras back then, right? So today we take it for granted that we just hold up our cell phone and snap a picture, but back then that wasn't available to us, right? All right, so building the company, I once was a TA for this class, recruited a fellow graduate student to enter the competition. We were fortunate in that we won, runner-up. I was told by the judges, though, that the reason we didn't win first place is no one believed we could build it, which is why I ended up building it that summer. And literally, it was started as 5 guys in the dorm room, which was sort of felt like that quintessential startup experience where you always hear about someone doing it in the garage kind of thing. But September 30th, 1997, I find out we have a direct competitor that is a $500 million a year revenue company. And I'll tell this story in a second. Nonetheless, we pursue forward. We raised $1 million from a collection of angel investors a few months later. We develop an alpha prototype. I begin working on a set of strategies that are core to the business's survival, that related to intellectual property and technology, that helped with actually the marketing and the sales of what we were doing. We raised more money from a firm back then called CMGI, raised more for growth, and then we launched Mimeo basically 2 years after we conceived it, ahead of the competitors that we had met on September 30th, 1997. So crazy things can happen, right? And I wanted to sort of put it in context, right? So you saw the Mimeo product, and again, today we take it for granted with high megapixel cameras built into cell phones, but these were the solutions that basically you had back then, right? The Panaboard, which printed on thermal paper, softboard, which had 2 integrated lasers and a barcode thing and cost roughly $4,000. Smartboard. Smart's actually one of 2 companies still left in this space because of the existence of Virtual Ink and going from a board-based product to a stylus that fit on any surface and made it a writing surface, I could create essentially any board size. It could be 2x3, it could be 4x6, it could be 4x8. And as a result, these folks were very cost limited in terms of both the materials for the product, the shipping of the product, the setup of the product, and the unfortunate different failure modes for this product, right? So here we were coming in at about, well, that was IBID, which was another board. It was only 2x3. So this early, just simple market analysis sort of set the price point for what we needed to do very quickly. So the direct competitor, EFI, electronics for imaging. EFI was a company that made the internal components for color laser copiers. They were the exclusive licensee of a patent, I think, from MIT, to do color separation, and they were basically the guts of the large, high-performance color laser copiers. Again, we take for granted today, I have a nice color laser printer at home, right? But back then, these were monstrous things that cost a lot, and being able to do that efficiently was an issue. And so when we met, when we met with EFI, and the reason we met with EFI is I began to interview for different candidates to help us out from a business perspective. The founding team were essentially 5 engineers. We didn't know anything about business, right? So we interviewed a CEO candidate at the time, and the CEO candidate said, you guys capture information from the board, kind of makes sense that you want to print it. Maybe there's an opportunity to work with someone who's a leader in that space. And it set up a meeting with the marketing director at EFI. And so myself, Mike, and the CEO candidate, we all flew out. I insisted on having a non-disclosure agreement in place. You'll find out why that's important in a minute. And we have the meeting with the marketing director and some of his staff. And I'm sort of just freaked out by all this. I'm like, I'm just a grad student, and now I'm talking to the senior management of this massive company that's incredibly successful and known to be very, very competitive, right? So I'm just excited about just being there. And we give our pitch for about 20 minutes. And at that point, we didn't bring the system with us. We just brought these mock-ups that we would stick on the board. And it was kind of a hand-wavy kind of thing, but they got it. So the marketing director said, this is really interesting and really exciting. I'm going to go grab the CEO and see if he can join us for this meeting. And I'm like, this is so cool, right? So he comes down, this fellow who seemed very sort of Napoleonic in stature and in attitude, very sort of stern-looking face. And we go through the whole pitch again, really excited for another 20 minutes or so. And I said, so, do you think there's an opportunity for us to work together? And he says, well, actually, we already built this. You want to see it? It's next door. And I said, probably not a good idea. And he starts to ask questions about what it is that we've done. He says, well, how do you deal with this particular thing and this particular thing? And as I started to realize, I realized that there were 3 or 4 critical technical issues that they hadn't solved. First was the stylus was tethered for their first implementation. Whereas we had already figured out how to build from a user's factor, you didn't want to have a cord where people would be tripping over and then suing you because they tripped over your Mimeo device. So we said, all right, it's got to work like people work, some sort of stylus in their hand. And he starts asking more questions, and he's actually giving me more information than I think he realizes about the state of their project. And I said, well, what about, so I start asking questions, and I said, well, what about the issue with air conditioner vents over the whiteboard affecting I start making up stuff. What about sunlight coming in and affecting the infrared transceivers that, and he's, oh, we've solved that, we've solved that, we've solved that. Everything I would say, oh, we've solved that, we've solved that. So in the end, I realized, okay, these guys are direct competitors. I have a sense of where their gaps are technically. I have a sense of how far ahead our solution is, partly because of, at this point, just an intuition of the things that I'd understood technically as an engineer. And so we end the meeting. But before we end the meeting, the CEO, it was sort of one of these Khrushchev shoe-banging kind of moments. He goes, if we decide to make you a buyout offer, it would be best to accept it. That was literally the comment to me. And I said, you know what? Last week I was in a lab at MIT. This week I'm sitting in front of a really successful CEO. I don't know what next week brings, but I'm having a great time doing this. So, may the best man win. Great to meet you. Good luck, right? And I leave sort of happy as a clam. So we walk out to the parking lot, and I did have a cell phone. It was one of those big things. And the marketing director calls us in the parking lot. And meanwhile, my co-founder, Mike, and the CEO candidate are like, oh my God, we're so screwed. These guys are going to bury us. I'm like, nope, they're about 1.5 years away. They haven't solved this problem, this problem, and this problem. Like, are you sure? I'm like, totally. And he said, well, what about all those other things you're talking about? I said, I made half of those things up. So, so the phone rings, and the fellow calls, and he says, listen, I want to apologize. This was the marketing director who would invite us out. I want to apologize because I got you out here on false pretenses. We wanted to learn a bit more about what you guys were up to. But I'll tell you, I'm actually leaving this company next week. And in the time that I've worked here, I have never seen the CEO go as ballistic as he did when you guys left the room. No one's ever talked to him that way so fearlessly. And he was like, why can't I hire engineers like that, right? Who don't fear anything, gets stuff done, right? So, and he says, and lastly, I want to help you raise your first round of financing and get on this train, right? So you literally never know where these meetings can go, right? When you think you have your head in the lion's mouth, and it just turns out to be the thing that ends up booting the company for us, right? So literally within 6 weeks, he had corralled 7, 8 investors. They each put in 50 to 100K in. And I think, as I mentioned before, by April, we had our first round of financing in, and we were off the ground running, right? So I love telling these stories because they're just, not many people tell these kinds of little tidbits. I'm going to look to Joe and Yost for some feedback on what to skip. Usually I incorporate some of these things. So what did I do right? I had a mutual NDA, right? I knew going in that meeting, if I didn't have some legal protection to force this company to document what we talked about and to say what was mine and what was theirs, right? If I naively went in and saw what they had implemented, I could be held. They could say I stole the idea from them. Instead, I didn't look at anything. We signed a mutual NDA. I got back. I wrote down exactly what I said, what was disclosed, and what I expected them to hold as confidential, right? So I'll skip a lot of this, but basically, you got the synopsis on legal stuff. Do it right? Find an attorney who knows how to do this sort of thing with getting a startup company off the ground. You have to incorporate. Don't put yourself at personal risk financially or otherwise, frankly. And just get the basics done, right? Confidentiality agreement, restricted stock agreement, contractor agreements, NDAs. These are things that, frankly, actually, if you need some of this and you're looking for templates, email me. I have templates. I'm sure Joe has templates. We all have templates for this sort of stuff if you don't want to engage with an attorney. But you should do really some of the basics because you just don't know when you start talking in the marketplace what can happen, right? I'm going to skip. Was there a question? And please interrupt and ask questions. I know I get kind of animated and I'm hand waving, but question?
Yeah, I have a question about the mutual NDA. How easy or difficult a time have you had or have you heard other people have in being able to get that? Because I find a lot of times nobody wants to sign anything.
Yes, so and that's very true in the investment community. So for example, for me at Data Tribe, I can't sign one simply because you come in with idea A and someone comes in with, A prime or A plus little widget difference. And if I sign an NDA with you and their idea is a little bit better and I decide to back them, you're going to come back and say, hey, you stole my idea or you gave that to them. That is essentially universally true amongst most investors, right? What I'm talking about here was business partners, right? So we were approaching them potentially to engage in some sort of business arrangement where we'd have to mutually disclose some amount of IP, some amount of product roadmap, right? Some of the stuff that's really confidential for a business to keep secret from the general public. Otherwise they give away their roadmap. But you're absolutely right. NDAs with the investment community is very rare, if not completely taboo. With companies, it's also very hard. Now, sometimes they'll ask you to sign their NDA, which can also work. And what I would, again, recommend, if you've got a good attorney who works with startups, they'll review the NDA and make sure that the clauses that refer to what you disclose are in there. There are not a whole lot of clauses that need to be in there to protect you, right? What it is that you consider confidential, the length of term for which you expect those things to be confidential, right? There may be some disagreement about liability issues, right? If something is disclosed, who's is at fault, and maximizing that and capping that liability. So you can get them to, now that will delay a meeting, that might require going back and forth with their counsel and your counsel, so that happens.
So have you been in situations when you walked because you couldn't get something?
Yeah, absolutely.
Does that happen often?
In my experience, it happens about a quarter of the time. Sometimes it's just because the company uses that as the means to just say they're not really interested. Other times, frankly, you have an attorney who's overly aggressive in their general counsel's office or that they outsource. It can vary, but it's actually fairly frequent that sometimes. Now, at that point, the person that I'm having the business interaction with will beat up whoever it is that is trying to is being their guard dog as from a IP perspective and say, just get it done. And that's 3/4 of the time. It's like, look, let's just be reasonable here. So do not be afraid to say no. But at the same time, you've got to figure out where that line and that slider is about how much you disclose, right? If you're going to disclose enabling material for someone else to go do, that's very risky. I wouldn't advise it without having some protections in place, okay? So I'm going to skip provisional patents except to say that they are great placeholders in time. And placeholders in time, for you science fiction fans, which I'll hit later, are awesome, right? Because I did something which was really cool in this later that has since become a closed loophole in the US patent law. But one thing that is important, I don't know if I'll hit a couple of these points, because yes, you've covered the mechanics of patents and the mechanics of getting an attorney for various business needs and so on. But how do you select people like that, right? How do you select someone? Really, you want to be explaining to your counsel what you're trying to achieve from a business perspective, because you can really spend a lot of money really quick on mechanics with no context of what it means to the business or the market you're trying to go after, right? So someone who has a sense of, who's asking you about where is this business in 5 years, right? Where are you going to be making most of your money? Is it in the US? Is it in Asia? Is it in the EU? What have you, right? Because that greatly influences not just the IP issue, but frankly, all your other corporate agreements as well, right? Especially now in the age of data, how you have to safeguard data, how you have, what data you must keep where, and so on, right? And the other thing I would say in terms of just selecting, you'll probably meet with a partner at this stage, right? Most of you probably don't have $1 million in the bank right now, ready to launch a venture. So some law firm is probably, if they really like you, is going to speculatively offer you some terms, maybe delay billing, maybe not bill you for the first X amount of work, right? But you want to make sure that you are working with a really good associate who's probably going to do the bulk of the work, whether it be corporate law or contract law or IP, because that relationship is going to be really important, right? You want someone who's done it before and is not just sort of figuring it out for the first time. And our first counsel that we ended up was also an MIT grad, Connect, and they ended up just doing delayed and discounted billing for us right through that first round of financing as well, right? So the other thing, because they were on the West Coast, I didn't want them traveling here, so sometimes I would go schedule my meetings along with other things just to cut costs. So once you get money in the door and the clock is ticking, that tub just keeps draining until you're making revenue. So you have to be fairly dollar conscious about what you're doing. I will probably end up skipping this, but because I emphasize patents a lot, mainly because folks who are doing biotech-related work, who are doing hardware-related work, who are doing design-related work, protecting your intellectual property is what gives you some sense of defensibility and differentiation, right? If you don't, if you think about it, a patent is essentially a term-limited right given to you by the state to go and monetize, essentially, get economic advantage for disclosure of an invention, right? Well, that's awesome, right? So you get some sort of limited intellectual property monopoly to at least get started in an attempt to try to recover your R&D costs. So, my thoughts in the beginning was, common thoughts and misconceptions. Oh, I have a patent, therefore I can go start a business. I'm very sure Joe talked a bit about this earlier. That's not the case. You might offensively try to protect something, but you have to look defensively as well, right? Investors want to know that if you're going to do something, that you have freedom to operate in that particular space, right? That you've done the due diligence technically to make sure that other businesses can't come and sue you, because the last thing an investor wants to do is put money into something if you haven't done the appropriate amount of due diligence and find out you're infringing on this portfolio of A, B, and C companies, and that blocks you from moving forward, right? That could be hugely detrimental to what you're doing. Patents are expensive, again, not necessarily if you deal with provisionals, which it sounds like it was discussed earlier. Again, I mentioned, if you're a technical founder, if you're able to do a lot of the prior art search yourself, you will learn a ton about how other people have approached the problem and who are folks who've already invested money in research in this direction. And then ask, well, what products have they based on this? Or what products have they not, or why haven't they based products on this, right? So just doing that research, if you're a technical founder, frankly means you can greatly influence what's going on in the business context. Right? Because you're now looking at who invested money in trying to secure IP. And then I mentioned, people say, well, big companies will crush us anyway if we have patents, so I'm not going to worry about that. And that's the whole David and Goliath story that I'm about to tell here. So knowing that EFI was extremely litigious with any company that tried to compete with them in that space, I realized that, as David here, intellectual property strategy for me was going to be what I'd have to secure to make sure that they couldn't come after us. So literally, I spent several weeks researching several hundred patents, really understanding what was happening in pen computing, what was happening in interactive whiteboards, what was happening in all sorts of interesting fringe and related technologies to get a broad sense of who were the technical players, going back 15, 20 years in some cases. And then we began to look at that. And you can patent all sorts of things randomly. But the thing that you want to be able to do is look at what you're doing as a system, understand what people are doing now, characterize what you're doing that's differentiating as a system. Either you're offering a new system, which means what? You either are you're giving an alternate way to do something, you are creating greater efficiencies in an existing way to do something, right? Or you're compressing a workflow in general, right? You're removing something that was there, right? So being able to articulate what you're trying to protect and what is making you different, what you have different in terms of value, is real critical. So I'll diverge for a second and I'll tell a story, because I think it was this one here. All right, so if you saw the Mimeo, you know that the stylus holder had a little ring so that the marker pen part can go through and actually make contact with the whiteboard. Well, the ring at the tip of the pen was an ultrasonic transmitter, right? And you couldn't buy these off the shelf. So we had to design our own. And we went down to the sole supplier of this material called PVDF, which was you apply an electric voltage, and it acted as a piezoelectric resonating material. And you apply the right voltage, and it does it in ultrasonic range. So, basically we can't hear it, but dogs go crazy. So we realized that the design of that sensor is actually really critical, because if you pick up the pen in any orientation, it has to work. But the material was printed on these large, so we went down to the shop where they made this material by the huge, sort of paper mill rolls. And what they would do is they had a machine where they would print out and stamp out whatever pattern you want. And if you made a round sensor, it would fold the material back, and then there was a little hammer that would sort of vibrate and melt a seam to connect a flat piece of that material, painted on both sides so that it can be a transducer, and except for this little spot. All right? Well, the problem is, once you weld it, you ruin the properties of that material, and it can't transmit in the ultrasonic range. So you get great transmission everywhere except in one direction, right? Or one small area of the angle there, and that's a problem if you pick up the pen the wrong way. So we asked them, well, how do you do that? And they said, well, we have this machine here, and there's this device and this hammer. So we had them explain it, and they said, well, and they insisted on designing this for us. And we said, no, we're engineers. We'll figure it out. So we went back, and we made a special anvil and designed a special hammer tip that went into that machine so that when the material was folded over, the seam was strong and as small as possible, and actually minimized that angle of dead spot, right? Which meant that essentially if you picked up the device and used it in our system, it didn't matter which way you held it, right? All right, why does this matter? Because fast forward again, when our product came out and our competitor's product came out, that company wanted to sell the sensors that it was selling to us to the other company, to EFI, because they were superior, far superior in terms of performance. And we're like, no. Send the cease and desist letter and said, you can't do that. We have patented the way that you're assembling to achieve that level of performance. You cannot sell them the same sensor, which infuriated EFI, right? Because they hadn't put in that kind of effort to figure out. So for us, what did that mean? We looked at essentially all the components in that system, what was a performance bottleneck in that system, patented the heck out of that so that anyone who wanted to achieve performance would have to go through essentially this block where we had now rights to. So literally, as these patents would issue month to month, I was so gleefully, we were sending letters to this big company saying cease and desist, because they were copying features, right? As these things came out, we were adding and releasing features knowing that we had protected them. For example, this may or may not have been in the video, we had patented the idea of using decals as control surfaces on the whiteboard. So you wouldn't have to go to the computer, but you could use a calculator on the whiteboard and tap things, and it would have audio response. Or you'd have a piano keyboard if you were teaching music, and touch the notes and continue to draw on the staff, right? So we were we were treating the ink as virtual ink, but also putting control surfaces on the board. And we described how to do that, right? Well, they thought, what a great idea, we'll do that too. Sorry, we patented some of that and the calibration process. And so they had to pull product back and frankly not release those features because they didn't want to have to release to their shareholders, because this was a small project in a big company for them that they were trying to build a new business unit. And so they didn't want to put themselves at risk. So the funny thing is, and again, this was the very first patent that issued. So for those of you who've never seen a patent, it's quite formal a document. It comes really nicely bound with a gold seal and some little red ribbon on it. But when we first got this, I was ecstatic, because the original design, as Joost and Joe will probably tell you back from the competition, was we had these two little things we stuck in the corner of the board with a cable that went to some controller and to the computer. We abandoned that design in the end, right, for that bar device you deployed along the upper left side of the board, because we could get much better resolution if we knew exactly where the sensors were, right? So we had solved the problem of size differently. But this looked exactly like EFI's product, E-beam, right? If you open the E-beam box, that's what it was. A little triangular puck there, a little triangular puck there, cables, this and that. And so I sat down with our director of business development, and I said, dude, we should totally use this. So we started going to the distributors, and as our patents were issuing, because we're a small company, as a show of force, we would put our patents on the table and say, look, I know we're a small company, but we've put a lot in terms of development and R&D and what we're doing here, and just take a look, right? So we'd open the first page, and they look at it and they go, oh, well, that's E-beam's product, isn't it? No, this is us. This is our patent. And they're like, really? Well, what does that mean for E-beam? Well, I don't know, but we've patented what we have, and the patent office has given us this patent. This is, well, heck, we're not going to carry E-beam's product if you guys are if you're just going to sue them because they're just going to return product back to us, or their customers aren't going to buy it when they read about it. So literally, the three major distributors that we approached about getting product in the retail channels like Office Max, Staples, and so on, refused to take the competitor's product for fear of potential patent litigation and customer confusion in the marketplace, right? This is not at all what I ever thought I'd be using the patent for. I thought that maybe if they came after us from a technology perspective, we'd have to go head to head. But it had the side implication was it was an asset, right? It was a business asset that I chose not to narrowly use in the technology domain, but frankly to sort of use in sort of the deal formation aspect of things and getting people to think what could happen. Now, we never said it was E-beam. We never said we had patented E-beam stuff. We were very careful not to make any kind of declaratory judgment statements. We allowed people to infer what they wanted to infer could happen, right? You have to do sneaky things when you're David facing Goliath. So, in summary, and again, a lot of folks dwell on patents and the minutia of writing the claims and all this stuff. It's a tool. It serves a business function of giving you some power, right, as a small company. And the question is, as a business tool, as an asset in your business, don't just think of it narrowly to deploy in a technical sense. In this case, it had its biggest impact in affecting how we were able to line up and close business partners. Question?
As a small company, how did you
That's a great question. So what we did is, sorry, I'll repeat the question. As a small company, how did we afford the time and the money to go do all this, right? So I mentioned in the beginning that I actually read literally hundreds of patents over a 6 week period because it actually was essential, I think, for our first round of financing. As I mentioned earlier, the investors wanted to know, can you build this? Because the first investor had already seen one working and wanted to make sure that whatever we came up with would not infringe on any of the prior art and would be different from what he thought E-beam would be. And he didn't tell us what E-beam was or wasn't. I never saw E-beam until I went to a conference, and we were at the same conference, and it was just sort of like dueling banjos, which was funny. But to answer the question, I, as CTO, did a lot of that early legwork, which I would also recommend, again, if you're a technical co-founder, it's just a treasure trove of information in order to close the financing. And that was for the first patent. The first patent, I think, was longer than my master's thesis, right? And then once we got funded, the strategy was, all right, keep filing provisional patents and then more full utility app patents as we started to get the design more solidified. And we were sort of figuring out in our roadmap how to leapfrog the competitors and cut them off from a feature perspective. So the first one was expensive. I think it cost us like $20K out of our $1 million, right? So, and about a good month and a half of my time solid. I mean, I'm talking like every day I'm mind-numbingly reading patents. But then it became part of the strategy. And then because we had done that early work, the investors are comfortable. Frankly, the law firm was comfortable enough in doing some work on delayed billing. But it all really ended up doing really well. So not your typical sort of patent lecture, right? Usually it's sort of people joust with patents back and forth like Apple and Samsung. Well, this wasn't at all the same sort of thing. We'll skip this because you might have done that already. So yeah, at first I thought it just needed for the investors. What I learned was a lot about the market. I learned, frankly, a lot more about how to build my product smarter, right? I saw what people had done in the past and couldn't do because the technology wasn't available. And what I do differently, in this particular case, not much. Because of that other CEO essentially doing the shoe-banging thing on the table, it woke me up to realize this is how they intend to kill us, right? So I had to have a strategy. Question?
Is there anything you would change now that it's first to file versus that time when it was first to invent?
That is a good, so the question is, there's difference now in terms of first to file versus first to invent. My sense is the use of provisionals intelligently can help you, right? So that's why I would encourage people to use provisional applications if you're going to go the patent route, to do that as soon as possible. And I'll cite one more thing. I'll cite one more thing on that in a second. So not much differently, but and it doesn't have to be patents. I just want to be really clear. I don't want this to be perceived as a whole lecture about patents. Whatever your core sustainable unfair competitive advantage is, right? If it's intellectual property, if it's your ownership of a channel, if it's a development of a brand, if it's your, whatever it is that you have that you can differentiate and defend against everyone else in that space, right? Think more broadly about it than just in the narrow sense of cost, customer channels, brand identity, product performance, right? So that sort of thing is really critical there. Actually, I'll finish with this because I think it answers, this is where I did this crazy thing where I went back in time. So provisional patents help address the issue of where you start to file at the point of you're filing a little bit earlier and reserve a year until you file a full utility application. So on a subsequent business, I was working on a company developing wireless network security, right? So we were doing location tracking via wireless networking in building down to 3 meters. So if you're in the lobby, I can provision you Wi-Fi access. If you walk upstairs to engineering or finance, your network capability is shut off as a guest, right? Unheard of in 2002, right? But there were some things I wanted to do, so I ended up searching, and and talking with an engineer that we had met who had worked at university and was working on something similar. And he had filed a provisional patent that predated us by a couple months. And we liked the guy, so we hired him and we bought the provisional patent from him, which gave us 6 months priority date to go and finish and incorporate that feature in our product, right? So no one ever talks about buying provisional patents, right? If, for, you know, I had never heard about that. My attorneys had said, Yonald, stop doing this. You're like breaking new ground in IP law every time I interact with you, right? So the idea that you could literally buy time. Now, he was the inventor. He was working for us. We just said, yeah, it just doesn't matter, right? The assignee doesn't matter. But we bought literally 6 or 7 months, which turned out to be 3 months ahead of another person who had filed something that was fairly similar. So anyway, did we want to take a break? Or? Okay, so I could talk about this for like 6 hours, but if people need to take a quick little break, now would be a good time because the financial story comes next. Now for this part, I'm going to ask folks to please don't take pictures or record this part because I go very much into depth. I name names. And you don't get a lot of people who will come here and sort of tell you the full story of what happens financially. And are you recording me? No, okay, all right. All right, so.
Let me just talk a little bit about what Yonald talked about. It's a very interesting and unusual story, and he goes into a lot of detail. As it relates to most new ventures, here are the relevant points, a little bit of the background. This was during the internet bubble. They raised over $70 million, which in 3 or 4 quick rounds of financing. This was way too much money, and it defocused the company. It led to the hiring of what I would call poor management. The defocus burned out through a lot of the cash. At the end of the day, the founders ended up with a very, very small amount of equity in the company, and they ended up selling the product, the whole thing off. Nobody really made much money in it. I think the lessons in general, beyond the fact that it was a bubble, similar to maybe the bubble we're in now, is understanding who your investors are, being disciplined about how you approach it, not assuming that by raising a lot of money you'll be able to accomplish a lot of things. Raising too much money often defocuses the company, as what happened in the case with Virtual Inc. So maybe I was hoping that Yonald would come back and he could tell us that particular story, but unfortunately I don't have any recording of it. After he does that, he then goes forward and talks more about raising money and venture capital. So we'll pick it up at that point.
Maybe their 5 general partners have also put in some of the capital to establish the fund. And let's say they do about 7 investments a year. These are probably reasonable numbers, right? And maybe they target about $5 million on average per investment per year, right? Well, to do that, note that they're raising fund after fund after fund. They go off to pension funds, high net worth individuals, other institutional investors to gain money who want to put some in high risk investments. And they have to do that every 18 months to 2 years. So they raise money, they try to put it all to work in the first 3 years, so that depending on the life of the fund, let's say it's a 10-year fund, they put the money to work in the first 3 years, and hopefully by the end of that fund, those companies have matured and are profitable and they can be sold or go public, right? So, they're off spending, a month basically every year and a half. Many of them attend conferences of some sort, right? So they're a couple weeks out of the year that they're doing that. So on average, I'd say they have 9 months of time to do some real work, right? And on top of that, as they start adding companies to their portfolio, right, 7 company boards, and let's say 5 board meetings per year, which is actually low for a startup, because in the beginning you're probably going to have monthly board meetings, or you're certainly going to have monthly board meetings when things are going off the rails. And some of those will be in person, some of those will be conference calls. So they're going to about 30 to 35 board meetings a year. So basically, they're coming and going to a board meeting almost every week, right? So they're on the plane almost on average once a week, right? And then they have to, don't try calling VCs Monday morning, because they have their partner calls and they all sort of go through the status of their portfolio generally, right? So, all right, that's half a day to a day gone per week, right? And if they see 1,000 business plans a year, which is probably a little high, and reject most of them, and the remaining number, the remaining number of those, they're looking at, they're inviting in for at least a screening meeting and maybe a pitch meeting, and it could be a couple meetings before they actually close a deal. So really, there's not a lot of time a VC has to hear and validate a particular investment, right? If you're just looking at the kind of triage, it's almost like ER kind of conditions constantly in the way that they have to run their business, right? So this is why in this class we've emphasized, the elevator pitch, right? Getting really crisp with what is your value proposition and your product market fit and what it is that you think you're doing as a business, right? The better you can get that down, well, then now you're going to get their attention, right? And to the extent that you can get that with a referral or going through some sort of competition or having market traction with early customers, and it doesn't even have to be paying customers. It has to be people who say, I use your product or service, and here is why it's different from someone else, right? Someone else is offering, and what I would be willing to pay for it, right? So if you have orders, that's great, because that's money in the bank. But if you don't, the ability to actually get other proxies in the marketplace to speak on behalf of you in their words, not in your marketing speak, but in their words of value, is really what's needed there. I used to delete this slide, but I feel like we're coming back to this, and I'm just going to highlight 2 points. That if you do raise angel money and you raise sort of a syndicate of angel money, 2 things about it: timing and, frankly, the number of investors you want to deal with. I've seen folks who raise money, this is also another lesson learned, right? Folks who raise money and they'll take 50K here, 20K here, 30K here, and that gets spread out over a long period of time, perhaps as a convertible note and so on. The challenge with doing that at times is if you go beyond just using a note and you're actually issuing stock, now you have a lot of investors. The investor relations aspect of what you're doing will consume a lot of time. It is better if you can get a bunch of investors together and have them form an investment entity that as one unit invests in you, in your company, not in you, but in your company. When I say in you, I mean really in your business, right? So this way you have one entity to deal with legally, one set of stock certificates and so on. I know it sounds kind of picayune, but you can imagine if you raise money from 15 people, now you got to call 15 people each time something happens to get their signatures. It can be a real problem. You really want one agent essentially representing all of that. So be careful if you do this sort of thing. And if you do, most angel investors will do some sort of convertible note. That was covered, right? The Charlie Tillett talk about convertible notes, right? Basically, they're loans that convert to stock with some floor valuation, with some other terms, right? So it's a fairly simple document to execute, 1 or 2 pages. An attorney can get it done for you in like an hour. That is probably one of the most common instruments that's used to get angel investment money into a company quickly, because you don't have to discuss valuation and you're not issuing stock, right? Because creating restricted stock involves a lot of legal work, all sorts of filings. You got to make sure all the investors are accredited investors. But a note is a loan, right? So this happens a lot at this particular case here. I used to say about 5 months, but believe it or not, I've seen some deal, at least in our experience, and maybe it's just us at Data Tribe, we've been able to get deals closed in less than 5 months, if it's something that we really like, right, with venture capitalists. And I have another slide to sort of break this down as to why. This category will tend to be people who worked in that particular business. So if you want to raise money for a business, find someone who was in that industry who might still be passionate about mentoring an entrepreneur or being involved in that business, right? Which is different than necessarily the speculative aspect of what VCs would do, which is they're targeting, what they believe is a trend that will pay off at some point. Well, like cryptocurrency, right? Everyone's sort of trying to figure out how to monetize blockchain in some way or another, right? So there's a difference here, I think, in tone, in focus, and frankly, in support. Often these folks will have contacts where you can give prototypes and get really, this whole lean startup concept now that's very popular about getting your minimally viable product in the hands of folks and iterating quickly to produce a product, right? Angel investors who come from that market space can probably find those people, right? And that may be more valuable to find out, am I solving the right problem versus taking a lot of money to build something and then finding out, oh, I built it and they didn't come, right? So I'd say there's still an expectation of exits that are about the same. Now, what I did notice, which was awesome, is that when I raised money from angel investors, they were much more accessible because of the mechanics of what I said with venture capitalists. They were much more accessible in terms of mentoring and offering their time to help me with understanding what I could do in the business. They were really great advisors and mentors. So, and again, as I mentioned, ex-entrepreneurs or senior vice presidents. And again, venture capitalists, if you're bringing someone on, I would almost say, unless it's extremely late stage, growth capital, private equity kind of thing, you really want people who understand and have lived either as some CXO office in the market space that you're trying to fundraise. Otherwise, it'll be hard to proceed, I think. So I think I've talked a bit about many of these things. And actually, Yost did a great job at the beginning. It is amazing to me over the last few years when Yost gets up and does his preamble, how it just seems there's another slide of communities and courses and opportunities to meet other peer entrepreneurs just in the MIT community alone, right? I think when I started out, that was about the list. There's just a few people, right? How many? Maybe bankers would know, right? Maybe my bank would know. Maybe the attorney would know. Maybe an accountant could be able to refer me to folks, right? I had a funny story with dealing with a local bank that will remain nameless because they have a lot of money and I don't want to get sued. Where in Massachusetts, if you were the CEO, or I should say the senior executive for a company, and you pay yourself before you pay your employees, knowing that things are going to go bad, right? You're criminally liable, or you were at one point. And so what happened is I had done a wire transfer to payroll, and I'd actually, as part of that, I'd also reimbursed myself for some expenses. And then I get a call from the payroll company saying, the payroll didn't go through. I'm like, what? We have $1 million or something in the bank. What's going on? So I go down to the branch office of this small little bank in Kendall Square. I said, what happened with this wiring of the money, right? Oh, well, it was Friday afternoon, and we got it mixed up, and we actually wired it out, but then wired it right back into your account by accident. Sorry. I said, you guys are a bank, right? This is one of your core business functions, is to move money from A to B, and you couldn't get that right, and put me in a situation where I'm worried if someone would perceive what I was doing as being inappropriate, having paid myself from the account separately from payroll. So I called up Silicon Valley Bank, a company that was extremely experienced in dealing with startups. And I said, I just had this really awkward situation happen with me. They're like, hey, no problem, we can help you. I said, great. Can you set me up with an account today? Yes. I go back down to the same branch bank, and I'm like, I go to the teller with a wire transfer to transfer all the money in the account into a new Silicon Valley Bank account, and you could tell the teller was like, I need to speak to my manager. The very same manager who I saw that morning didn't remember me and wanted to know, oh, well, what's going on here? I said, well, I was here earlier, and I didn't like the service, so I'm going to a bank that actually understands what they're doing. So, so these service providers can really be more than just functional people who are supposed to know how to do their job. In this case, this bank didn't. But Silicon Valley Bank, for example, is a bank that works with venture capitalists a lot, works with angel investors a lot, works with a lot of startup companies. And it's not to make an ad for them in particular, because there are a couple others, but because they work that nexus, they can be a great resource. So rather than just thinking former executives in a particular business line or the traditional finance people, some of these service providers are well connected because they're in the mix of the moving of the money and the decision making, right? So, and Silicon Valley Bank, in my experience, has been very, very helpful to deal with. There are a number of law firms that hang around MIT, and I think more so today than was when I started, will speculatively take on. If you go through the 50K and you do okay, or in a couple of years you do, or you raise a little money, you're going to find it a little easier to get help from some of these people because you come across as much more serious. Anyway, so consult your fantastic preamble presentation on what's going on. And frankly, if you're raising money from VCs, politely move on if you don't get a yes, they're interested after a couple meetings. And it doesn't, not rigorously too, but a couple meetings. Why? This is why. I was raising money for what became Everyscape, which was a company based on the PhD thesis of a student who sat there. That was the guy who sat there. Moke sat there, right? Who approached me after class and says, I want to start a business in a few months, and I want you to run it. And I'm like, okay. So the names have been redacted to protect the innocent, but these are the number of calls, hours on the phone with, these are different investor bars, and each bar height represents the hours I spent with the investors on the phone. And I want to say the top bar is probably about 20 hours. For every hour I'm on the phone, I want to remind you that there's a couple hours of prep to go fetch information for a question, or to go prepare, respond to some question that they might have, or to provide new information and so on. So of the 31 folks that I had reached out, and I'd say about half of those were cold calls, and half of those are folks I got to know because of my previous dealings. Pretty quickly after about an hour or two conversation, it's like, nah, not quite a fit for us, or too risky, or don't know, right? Some said, hey, this is interesting, come back. So you get an invite to a face-to-face meeting, or a second face-to-face meeting, and that thins out pretty quickly. And you get a handful of folks who say, we like this a lot, but they might be stuck on one issue, right? It could be, again, one of the issues I mentioned before, right? How is it defensible? How is it differentiated? How are you going to get it to market? How do you scale? What does the exit look like? All the questions that you've covered across these different, in the last few sessions here. And finally got to the point where I had 2 term sheets, which is awesome, because you can confidently go in the meeting and say, well, I have another term sheet, and I'll just take this under advisement, right? Thank you, and we'll get back to you, right? And you keep people in suspense. Now, the reality is, folks kind of talk to one another in the investment community. So the terms aren't going to be too different, and there's some wiggle room to do some stuff. But, and then I got to a point where a term sheet was signed. What I didn't know, well, actually what I did know is that what was great about these guys on the right is they were making referrals to other people that I should talk to in this space. So sometimes approaching investors for information about, well, who should I be approaching in this space is an awesome takeaway, right? If you can get an informational meeting, or you go in seeking advice rather than just trying to pitch a sale, you can network in a different way with them, which often the associates in a firm really like, And because they're getting to meet what's happening in the entrepreneurial space, and it builds your network as well. These were helpful investors as well. This is what I wanted to warn you about. I don't want to say the term because I don't want anyone to be offended, but there's a term used in Silicon Valley about what happened, if you remember, what Hooley did to Pied Piper by inviting them over and basically trying to intellectually grab as much information out of their head, right? That was what was happening during this meeting, and I didn't know about it, right? They were looking at another company that they thought was doing something related, and they were frankly wasting my time having me do due diligence by asking me questions that I was doing due diligence for them, right? So the point of the story here is, if you don't get 2 term sheets and this is happening, this represents a big pyramid of time that you're wasting. This was a full-time job for me for about 5 months, right, to raise money as the CEO of a small company. So, and I remember because we closed on Friday before I was giving the lecture, and Joe said, well, it's not really real until there's money in the bank. So I brought in the deposit slip and showed it to everybody in the class that day, just to show that it actually happened. So, yeah, so I think one other thing is to know VCs will often, I would say for the majority of their portfolio, the earlier it is in the investment fund's life cycle, the more activity they're probably going to be interested in making investments, right? And maybe at the end when they might have a little money left over. There is sort of an East Coast, West Coast difference. I should say Boston, New York, and Silicon Valley difference in terms of investment preference. But it seems like everyone in August is gone, right? So do your pre-meetings, if you're going to be looking at that time of year, well before August. So when September comes back and they're all rested and they want to do deals, you've already had a couple meetings and they're ready to go and you've demonstrated progress and you're talking to all of them and you sort of have this feeding frenzy. I'm going to skip over this because I think, last point is don't be afraid to say no thank you, especially to what I'll call is bad money, which is just unsophisticated capital, where someone is going to be, frankly, not value add aside from just putting money in, right? But prove that business model of market viability early, right? Find early adopters who can give you feedback, right? Prove that product market fit and iterate quickly, right? That's, the faster you can do that and get that solved and articulate that story, or frankly, they can articulate that story to who might be interested, is best. And I'll say sales or adoption, because you could have unpaid pilots, paid pilots, paid or unpaid proof of concepts. It depends on what it is exactly you're doing. There's a whole spectrum of what could be done next. But from my perspective, having helped with doing investments and looking at a couple hundred things in just the past year, those that got our attention were the ones, and here's a list of 10 customers that we have, and 4 of them we've converted to paying customers. Like, oh, okay, clearly they're doing something right? Someone else has seen value in this. And it's not like it's their brother and sister buying the product, but serious customers in the marketplace. So we thought, I think in the original Virtual Link business plan, that $3 million would be enough to get the profitability. That was wrong. Totally wrong, right? What we learned is making it real so that the customer can experience your offering, whether it be a product or service, even if it's just pre-prototype, and it's a must-have for them, is really powerful, right? It really guides the team, it motivates the team, it makes things real. What I do differently? Lots. Don't raise $70 million in venture capital like we did. Seriously, that's, unless you have figured out cold fusion or a cure for cancer, don't do it unless you really are at a point where you understand the mechanics of your business and understand the risks that you're getting. Don't blindly get talked into getting big fast, as I mentioned earlier. As a result, if it were up to me, I would have fired the CEO a lot earlier, and I would have hired a CFO a lot earlier. And I sort of foot stomped this earlier. And what happened, which was interesting, was, and it's sort of awful, but after 9/11, people were afraid to get on planes. And if you look at the damage it did, frankly, to American industry, people would not fly to conduct business, right? Video conferences and audio conferences were the thing. And the thing that was often missing was that collaborative exchange of ideas at a whiteboard which was the reason people would be traveling from A to B to meet with other folks often, right? If it's not just to sort of physically sign documents or that kind of thing. So I would have looked at developing a set of telepresence stuff that matched what was going on in response to a universal market pain that was interfering with business. So yes, academia and teaching was an issue, but if we had actually shifted away earlier, after that happened, and thought, well, we can actually help businesses at a distance, not just share their voice and their video, but really their data. And we actually had patents to share a virtual whiteboard at a distance that we really didn't monetize as a product offering. Question?
Yonald, you, as the leader of the 5 founders, all technical people, could have made a case that you should have been the founding CEO. And yet only a few companies later did you really know what you were doing as CEO. So, I mean, the technical people finding this co-founder or CEO.
Yeah, I think I hit this here. And that's a great segue. That's a great segue, right? So, I'm a great startup CEO. I'm great at sort of binding the team, finding the talent, getting those early investors, really going from concept to company to clearing the trees at the end of that runway and taking off in record time, right? That's sort of my forte, right? I get really animated. I really sort of just love that whole process of just going from nothing to something, presenting product early on to customers and watching them have that aha experience, right? That was something that I think was endemic to me as an engineer. I wanted to build things that helped or helped people. And so that tapped into something that was really important and interesting to me. But the skill to be a CEO, I think there was partly an insecurity on my part that I didn't really understand sort of the mechanics of building a sales organization, right? Or I didn't really get marketing, and so I think to the gentleman's point here, I had to find chefs, not cooks, and didn't know that was the question I needed to ask, and didn't know who I needed to ask it of, and unfortunately let the CEO that I hired make all those decisions without having, frankly, other input, right? I think, yeah, so I could have been the CEO, and I think there was maybe a juncture when there was initial turmoil, because I didn't have board speak, right? It's like the Fed chairman. Whenever the Fed chairman says something, everyone sort of hangs on every word, right? It's irrational exuberance. Oh my goodness, go sell, sell, sell. I think board speak is something like that, where I may have been asked if I was interested in being the CEO, and I didn't quite really understand, and said, no, I don't think I'm ready for that, realizing that maybe they were contemplating a change, and they were aware that something was not right, and were gauging my own interest. So there was an opportunity that I maybe missed, and perhaps if I had been in that role, asking the questions I was asking, seeking the mentorship that I was seeking, it might have been a different outcome, right?
Can I just add a small?
Yeah, sure.
Maybe politically.
I think, I forget what it was, but it was an MIT event, and it was actually a very wealthy donator to MIT, who I won't mention. But I got into this almost shouting match at a conference in a workshop over this very topic. Because this person was donating money to create, to take engineers and have them be basically middle managers. And I was saying, no, everyone should be taught these principles of leadership and how they apply to different functions of business, right? The outer circle for me wasn't The outer circle for me was leaders, and the inner one was engineers that need to, and that circle needs to expand so that people, and certainly that what is Sloan is about, right? For those who have a technical background or not, is trying to build leaders, right? It's not about building people who are just, managers, right? And so, this is not coming across as well as I'd like, but there is, you look at the founding team in my company, it was 5 of us, master's level or better trained in engineering. The spectrum was tight and 2 sigma to the right? At least, right? We were completely fearless. Even if we can build it, antimatter, we'll do it, teleportation, we'll do it, anything, whatever it was, we were gonna go do it and figure out how to do it, right? And you're right, as you bring in folks in the company, keeping that quality standard high is very hard because people have different skills and different backgrounds, right? And so, now, despite what you might see here, I just love this topic, but I'm actually a pretty introverted person, except when I'm talking about something where I'm really, really excited, right? And so many engineers, and I've had engineers where I've taken them to sales meetings, and I'm like, thou shalt never go to a sales meeting again because didn't know how to interact with the customer appropriately, right? Or said the wrong thing. So it can work, it can cut both ways, right? But I think, again, it's again a question of, in this case, right, your board was dominated by an investor who made a choice of an executive that dictated what was going on from a management perspective that percolated down to probably some poor hiring decisions and execution. And the CEO we hired was a marketing guy. I hired him because he sold electronic whiteboards in the space. I thought he had mastered that market space and could be useful. And he was, at the marketing part, was phenomenal. He was not good at the basic mechanics of blocking and tackling and building a business within the confines of a budget, right? So you give a marketing person, $47 million in one round, and it's like, woohoo, right? Without a CFO to sort of rein them in, and I know I'm beating up on marketing people, but if I gave you $500,000 to spend at a trade show to build a booth for marketing people in the audience, and that was your budget, would you spend it or not? You wouldn't? Really? Good. I'd probably hire you then. All right. So, but to this point, I think, what is your objective when you start a business? Because I see a lot of different entrepreneurs. I see folks even coming out of MIT and so on. Look, if you have 5 founders, there can't be 5 CEOs, right? You're going to have to divide up the roles. You're going to have to understand that in the end, a team, it's going to take a team, but not all of you can be in charge, right? There's some judgment involved. And some of you may have different objectives, right? You want to take the job, experience a startup for a year or 2, and then go do something else, right? If you're driven by wealth and having some sort of Caribbean mailing address, and that's your objective, you're going to operate differently, right? And you're going to behave differently, and that's going to affect your peers, right? So, do you want to raise any money at all, right? I can't tell you, out of this class, I've talked to a number of folks who have come away taking the message, and I'm not saying that you should do this, where they decided not to take investor money and be really scrappy for a year or 2 years without salary and, beg, borrowing, and stealing, and have built for themselves respectable small businesses making $5 to $10 million where they own the whole company, they've employed some people, and they feel great about what they're doing, right? We should probably invite more of these people to come and talk about those experiences, right? Closing multi-tens of million dollar VC round is not the objective, right? It's to build viable businesses that hopefully positively impact society. So, understanding, are you ready? Do you believe in what you're doing? Do you believe in who you are? And I think you have to understand your difference between risk and uncertainty. The future is uncertain, but if you certainly, if you do things recklessly, you're adding unnecessary risk, right? Everyone at MIT is used to working really, really hard. And quite frankly, that's where a lot of you have an advantage because you're used to that level of pain, right? You're used to being able to sort of deal with difficult challenges. And that's what I think, in my experience, what was great about, about, frankly, MIT as an undergrad institution and also as a graduate institution was just the level of, difficulty that was placed in front of you, not in a masochistic way, but just to keep challenging you, right? So that just like a boxer is sort of punching above their weight to understand what you're gonna deal with, right? So, but if you're a sort of person that doesn't feel comfortable operating without a safety net or without knowing what the future holds below a certain threshold, this is going to be incredibly stressful, right? It's going to be hard enough as it is, right? Because you're going to be spending, so much time with your co-founders, it's almost as if you're all married, right? And there's going to be times of frustration and stress and name calling and things where you don't talk to one another for a while because you're all angry about something. Those things happen. But, being able to tolerate that kind of risk and not knowing and being comfortable with it is absolutely critical, right? So anyway, all right, building the team. I will quickly go through this. Many people ask me, how many founders should I have? Well, we had 5, and they were all, one was my friend Mike, who I met in the pub, who had the idea. Another was Mike's friends, and the rest were folks who worked in my research lab, who I had been working with for 3-4 years, where we had, had great times and it butted our heads. So we had sort of tested this kind of team dynamic already, right, partly. But I think 2 to 3 is pretty reasonable, right? And they should all be bringing some sort of complementary core competency together to the team, ideally. Unless it's something that it's so complex an issue where it takes 2 or 3 complementary experts to go do something in the same field. 2 to 3 is reasonable, right? And if it's not, fix it, right? So I mentioned I had to fire a co-founder very early on because it became, although this person was helpful early on, we had reached a point where the input by that founder was no longer adding value. In fact, was really an energy drain and an energy vampire, if you will, on the rest of the team. So here was I asked someone to join the team, and then I find myself, the team says, we can't proceed with this individual because they're not pulling their weight. And it's dragging the rest of us down. And that person didn't speak to me for years. Really hard thing to do, right? I wasn't mean about it. I was just saying, this is where we need to be. And I'm not sure that this is going to work with you as part of that team, right? Doing that earlier and just pulling that Band-Aid off quickly is really important. Yes, you've got to have the same sense of vision for what it is that you want to achieve collectively. You may all have personal different goals in terms of career or, as I mentioned in the previous slide, but where the entity has to go has to be in the same direction, right? If you don't have unity in that direction, things will schism and split very quickly thereafter. How to manage disagreements? What do you do when things get rough, And the team really includes these concentric circles of people formally as part of the entity and who are supporting the entity, right? Obviously, your core team who has equity ownership and your investors are closest to that, but you should always be thinking about this extended network of folks who are part of the team to help you, right? And what's interesting is about these outer circles, they can change more frequently, and probably will, right? Advisors are needed early on, and perhaps even, accountants and bankers and lawyers might change when you're a $1 million company, and if you're fortunate enough to build a $100 million company, some of that will necessarily change because of the scale of what's going on and the type of business you might be doing, right? So, these things will mix it up and change over time. I found VMS is still fairly active from what I understand, right? In my experience when I was here, what I loved about VMS was just the code of ethics they had. And even as an experienced entrepreneur, look, the way I look at it is Olympic athletes who are the best at what they do in the world have coaches, right? They seek someone who is outside of their own experience to give them perspective on what they do to get better. And so I use VMS in that way. Folks who are a little older, hopefully a little wiser. I didn't agree with all the advice they gave me, but they didn't have an equity stake. They were banned from doing so. They gave me a perspective on things, and we were able to, I treated them like my other board, and I would present my questions in a way to sort of practice. How do I get that kind of practice? And it was really, really useful. So I want to plug VMS because I found it really useful, and I still hope. I don't live in the area, so I'm not as active as I used to be in VMS, but you know, having those proving ground opportunities with people who've been in those roles and can be sounding boards are really great, right? So the more of those. I used to be a member of Entrepreneurs Organization in Boston for 10 years. And I don't know if a similar program exists from what I'm about to describe here. But when I was an EO, we would have peer CEO meeting groups once a month, 8 to 10 people who were not in the same market space, but all of them had to be a founder of a business or major corporate officer of a business that had at least $1 million in revenue. And we would meet every month to talk about, in an extremely confidential setting, business, personal, and family issues, right? And the ability to go in, and then if you missed a meeting, you were out. You had to be voted back in. That's how seriously we treated these meetings for 10 years, right? And I missed a meeting once, and I was horrified because they came back out and handed me my stuff as sort of a joke, as if to say, you gotta go, and they're like, no, come back in the room, right? But I loved that group because I could get peer advice. I could finally hear someone saying the very same thoughts and frustrations about, you know, what was going on, right? I mean, being an entrepreneur, you're pouring all this time into your business. Well, are you taking care of yourself? Are you taking care of your family? How are you putting all these things in balance, right? So I would encourage, if there isn't something like that that exists for entrepreneurs at this stage, even at this fomentive sort of team forming stage, that the ability to network like that is really critical to get advice from peers. Finding peers, just people who will understand where you are and you can relate the experience, and getting stuff off your chest can be really, really useful, because then it frees you to now say, finally, okay, I'm not insane. All right, now how do I fix this problem, right? Or how do I address this issue? All right, this is a lot of verbiage, and I'm sorry, that's a lot of, I'm breaking every rule in the book about presentations, but, if you're a technical person who's looking at startups, and there were a few in the audience here, right? Your job is to be dealing with not only making it work, but trying to find ways technically to support the business to be defensible, right? You are de-risking the business risk through technology, right? As a technical person. Everything you're doing is about trying to manage that business risk intelligently, right? So your job is to look at what assets help me do that, right? So you're building a product roadmap, or you're adding the product roadmap, or you're thinking of future products, or you're going on, all of that. For the folks who are business leaders, looking back at it, and I know I mentioned that I kind of mocked it in the beginning about culture, not really understanding why every other Sloan Management Review article and HBS article was about culture and culture formation, right? Folks who are trained, I think, in that kind of real good management and leadership, when you start that at the beginning and that becomes part of the DNA of the business, it is incredible. We worked really hard to do that at Virtual Inc. And I'll tell you there are about 20 people who still, who literally get together like every week just to hang out. And a number of them have gone on to form companies together or to hire one another in the future because they've just built a rapport and trust. And that's great. Now, the business leaders, I think, you're often talking and working with the technology, the folks who are on the technology, and I think this addresses some of the issues where you were talking from the other side of the fence. Especially here, don't confuse the chief XO with the VP of X, whatever it is. You want to be able to take your technical people. One of the best things I ever did was assign Crossing the Chasm to all of my engineers. I bought them the book because all the marketing people were talking about that language at the time. And none of the engineers had any idea what it meant to, cross the chasm or what, So I bought them all the book. We all talked about it. And now finally the marketing folks and the engineering folks had a common language that wasn't their mutual domain jargon, that they could communicate about what was going on. What are we trying to do? Well, we're trying to find innovators and early adopters for this product. Like, oh, okay, I get that. So establishing that common ground, and that's really, I think, going to come from the folks who have that business perspective that relates to culture formation, right?
We need to finish.
We need to wrap up. Whoa, look at that, it's 5 to 9. I could talk for another 4 hours, but I know you guys can't. Stay here. All right, you'll get these slides, so don't freak out. I've actually cut 1 or 2 from this list, but everyone should have read these books or read them, right? Only the Paranoid Survive, Crossing the Chasm, Innovator's Dilemma. I would say the next 3 books here, they're in vogue, but they're actually really good in terms of a working methodology, another methodology that you can use to identify product market fit and iterate quickly to get an MVP. And Blue Ocean Strategies, I think it has 5 nice use cases to talk about for different industries. How Cirque du Soleil revolutionized the circus industry, how Yellowtail Wine changed what was going on in the wine industry. Term sheets and valuations, Alex Wimbledon is a VC, was a VC in the Boston area. I would add this book as a must-read now, right? Because I think I reread it recently and I thought, wow, this perfectly tracks so many of the problems I've seen with team formations and the inability to go beyond trust and so on and so forth. So it's for those whether you're a technical person or a business person, I would recommend that book. Fears. All right, parting thoughts. Love risk. You have to be the trapeze artist, right? You've got to be able to be comfortable with dealing with the unknown and the unpredictable if you're going to be an entrepreneur, right? You are going where no one has gone before in many cases, right? And maybe no one will ever go again. But you won't know that until you take that step. So you've got to love risk. The other thing is, frankly, be great, right? Pursue some, if you're trying to build a business, just be great about it, right? Be wholesome about it. Be inclusive about it with your team, right? Trying to build a great culture, as I was talking about before, right? Aspire to a sense of values in your organization that really connect to something profound, right? As I mentioned before for Virtual Inc., when we got those letters from those kids, it was a huge awakening to what we were really about, what we were doing in the world, what we were affecting, versus someone else who was going to a school and selling them an electronic whiteboard, right? At the same time, don't let greatness go to your head. Be humble, right? That sense of humility will keep you grounded, will keep you, frankly, paranoid, right? About, well, what am I not thinking about that I should be doing, right? Am I being overzealous in a particular thing, right? That sense of humility, just don't lock, stock, and barrel swallow your entire marketing and believe it. Have some sense of healthy skepticism and humility, right? Be collegial. What does that mean? This goes back to what I was talking about peer groups. I've been to way too many entrepreneurial functions where I see an entrepreneur who says, oh, I need a web person. Oh, I need a finance person. Oh, I need a a whatever. Rather than saying, hi, so what's your business about? What are you looking for? What do you need to do, right? When you go to these events, you want the networking effect to work. The networking effect works when you literally go in and you try to listen to 4 or 5 other people and find out what they want, right? If you go in transactionally and try to just get something out, that's not network effect. That's order 1, not order n squared, for those of you who understand what I'm talking about. We want that cross-fertilization of people. You want calls coming inbound to you, and the only way that happens is if, frankly, you're listening to other people and enough other people so that, frankly, they're looking to connect on your behalf, right? That's the kind of collegiality I'm talking about. Working collectively as a much larger organism in a community. Have fun. This is going to be strenuous. It's going to be, at days, incredibly awesome, right? I mean, the thought that I would be, 1 week in the lab dealing with equipment that wasn't working, and the next week sitting in front of a CEO of a $500 million a year revenue company and then being able to tell him, good luck. You're going to have just awesome stories and awesome fun, but if you're not able to sort of extract some of that fun, then why are you doing it? You know, if you can't derive some sense of passion out of it. And then lastly, enter the competition. I'm serious. Enter the competition, okay? I did it in '94, got that feedback, bounced back from that feedback 2 years later, learned a lot, and it took a couple bites of the apple, and it launched my career, right? And for me, this changed my life. This class changed my life. I'm hoping that this experience of entrepreneurship in general does the same for you, and that, frankly, we can live in a freer and safer world because of things that you folks do, right? So that's that. I'll get you the slides without the finance part. I'm sorry, I can't give that away because I know there was some verbiage at the end that might be useful to folks. If any of you want to reach me, put nuts and bolts in the subject so it gets past my spam filter. That's my email address. It's like Ronald, except it starts with a Y. Don't put Yoland because I don't own Yoland. I don't really write a blog. I do this. But if folks are interested and they have specific questions and say, hey, you know, I really like this, or could you talk more about that experience? You know, we've talked about perhaps compiling some sort of, I don't know, we've joked in the past about writing a book or writing something like this, but there's a lot of experiences that we all have, and I'd like to get your feedback as to what was useful or what you wanted to hear more of would be great for me personally. Also, I'm looking for an expert here. There's someone here today who happens to be an expert in data visualization or software-defined networking. I'd be curious to talk to someone. But I'll hang out, and I want to hear what you guys are working on so I can help you connect to other people. Thank you.
You know, I thought we would take some time. Hopefully you saw the full Yonald presentation. I thought I would take this time to just take general questions about anything that you thought about over the course of these 6 sessions, and see if we can have a little bit of a discussion. And if people are okay, we can even finish early. But why don't we put the questions in the chat, and I'll see what I can come up with here. Or if you, so this would be about anything relating to either Donald's presentation or any of the topics that we've had, or anything we haven't covered that you think is important.
There's a question in the chat, Joe.
Right, so I'm looking for some good resources for team building. Any books or lectures you can recommend? I don't have any really specific things. I think you've heard a lot about the topic. Maybe Founder's Dilemma would be a good book to talk about some of the pitfalls. That's Noam Wasserman. If anyone else has a recommendation that's on the call, please post it up there. And, you know, part of some of the things you'll read on team building really are teams in larger organizations, and it goes into dynamics of how large organizations work. So, okay, there's actually a course. Oops, I just lost it again. Teaching any classes in the spring. We do a seminar on Tuesday nights out of the Edgerton Center. I think it's EC 074 or 075, but it's a seminar type setting. And it's it's not so much teaching, that's really more like live cases. In the physical world, we'd have people coming in and talking about their particular business. So Drew Houston was in our seminar as he was thinking about a thing that turned into Dropbox. Let's see. What else can we see? Do we have any legal templates? Non-disclosure. In the legal presentation that I did, the deck there's some links to the Cooley.com, and I think Goodwin Proctor has, I think it's called the Founders Workbench. Both of those firms, and I think there's another one listed in there, have sort of standard boilerplate forms. You do want to make sure that you use them appropriately, but I've used some of those myself. Let's see, not specific to entrepreneurship, but it's, okay. Okay, let's see. Richard, who co-teaches the EC 075, has got a comment in there about asking for some teams to help us in the seminar. Let's see, there's a question about potentially offering up our technological idea for research by a classmate and the IP protection you would recommend to have. So they will not be part of the team. Well, that would be, so I'm not quite sure I understand the question fully, but it would be, you want someone to do some legwork around some part of the business idea that you're coming up with, but they're not going to be part of the team. So at the very least, a non-disclosure agreement, and depending on the nature of the work being done, consultant services agreement that makes it clear that you retain all the rights. You're hiring the person as a work for hire. And I think there are standard forms of that at either the Cooley site or the Goodwin site. And as somebody points out, yes, new enterprises. This IAP course has been 6 evenings, and it's certainly not going to cover the depth that some of the other courses do. Like new enterprises, has a complete build out for a whole term. So think of this as your first step to getting into that. And as I said on the first night, we have people that have never taken or even thought about entrepreneurship to people that have come back, as their second or third company. So we're really trying to make sure we get the basics out to you. Let's see, there's a question regarding patents. If your invention involves several, yeah, the question is whether to bundle things in one patent or not. If you put too many inventions in one patent application, the patent office may require you to split it apart. So let's say your invention is an office suite consisting of a desk, a lamp, a chair, and a bookcase. The USPTO may say, no, those are 4 separate inventions. You need to split them apart and file separately. From a perspective viewpoint, though, if you're dealing with investors or strategic partners, the question is whether 4 separate patents is more impressive than 1 patent, and what the relative cost is on that. And as it regards the basic patenting thing, the idea of being able to make sure in your initial disclosures on these that you're broad enough that you can tack on other things. So, for example, right now, we're working off a set of patents we filed 6 years ago. And we're now up to, we've got 10 allowed patents and 18 applications pending off of that. And because we have enough description of the thing in the first patent, we're able to file continuations and add additional material. And that's being paid for by our collaboration partner, the large company. So the idea is you tee it up and make sure you preserve rights. And then if you do a partnership with a company or a licensing thing, they'll continue to pay for prosecution. And especially if you start in the US, foreign applications, the whole international patenting thing gets expensive very quickly. And so, on the other hand, if you've really got a good value proposition and you've got the basic patents there, your collaboration partner is very happy, relatively speaking, to pay for those expensive ones in Europe and the rest of the world. Let's see. How to build trust with new people that you socialize with over Zoom. Yeah, boy, isn't it hard enough in the real world over Zoom? I don't know if I could touch that one. I'll let other people. Let's see what else we have. Resources. There's some comments there about listening and team building. Is there a LinkedIn group or Slack group for nuts and bolts? There is a LinkedIn that's been inactive. If people think Slack would be useful, we could do that. We tried this team building with the breakout sessions, and then the TA suggested WhatsApp, although I haven't seen much action there. Dino, do you have any observations on the WhatsApp?
I haven't seen any action there either. I think Claire and Sam shared the links to the various groups maybe last week or the week before. And it seems like people are joining, but I haven't seen any meaningful conversation or dialogue happening there.
All right.
So feel free to use that as you wish. We'll be exiting and it'll become a private chat.
Okay. Well, we've been over the years trying to figure out how better can we assist in team formation, and we've tried a variety of things. So I'm always open to new ways. In the physical world, there's the serendipity. I had offices in Kendall Square, and I would go out for lunch and run into a couple people that I knew, and introduce them to each other. And the next thing you know, there was a company, just because wandering around the village square or the village market or the watering hole is an important part in things happening. And I don't know quite how to replicate that in the virtual world. What's the best way to reach out to the MIT undergraduate community to join, to have somebody from MIT join a startup team? Is that the way I should interpret that? Well, there are a variety of student groups on campus. That's probably the best way to do things. There's the entrepreneurship club. There are various things in the engineering school. We should probably post some of those as a resource. So I'll make a note to do that for you. In fact, there's Richard mentioning the Entrepreneurs Club. Okay, good. Can you register for? Can you register as a listener in the seminar through the Canvas system? Well, Canvas is, you have to have MIT credentials to be in the Canvas system. So if you're not an MIT, if you don't have an MIT certificate, you won't be able to do that there. Richard and I should talk about whether we think we can open up the seminar. Seminar traditionally has only been a dozen or so people, and it's very free form. We've been very structured in the 6 nights here. In the seminar, we have themes for each night in case we don't have a live case study that night. And we'd much rather, spend time sort of hacking around somebody's business or technical idea than doing something formal. But we'll see how that develops. Let's see. So Richard's posted an email address so you can talk to him about that. Who will be the judges for how do we reach me after class, I assume? I have an email, jgh@mit.edu, and I'm going to ask Tierno to talk about who's going to be the judges for the 100K competition. I judged that for probably 20 years, haven't been involved recently. So you want to explain what kind of people and a little bit of...
Yeah, absolutely. So for the Accelerate competition, judges are going to be selected from a number of venture capitalists and entrepreneurs and people who are in industry. And the goal this year is to match competitors with somebody who has experience with the industry or sector that they're launching their business in, so that they can better assess the viability. And as a reminder, the Accelerate competition is more of a showcase. So there's not going to be live judging in the same way that you have during pitch. So during pitch, you give your 90-second introduction to your business, and the judges give you feedback on the spot. But for Accelerate, the judging happens in the background, and on the day of the event, it's more of a showcase where each of the teams selected to participate talk about kind of their prototype or the work that they've done so far to prove that their business idea is viable. Audience Choice Award, where the participants who actually interacted with you are gonna vote and determine whether they were convinced by your explanation and kind of the prototype that you came up with. So hopefully that helps answer the question.
I don't know if you can do it quickly, but what's the time frame of each of the sessions? In other words, Accelerate is when, and we can send it out to the list afterwards, but perhaps a good time to give an overview of where the 100K goes from here. Mm-hmm.
So Accelerate is going to happen on March 11th, and applications are open currently. They went live on the 18th of January, and they're going to be open until February 7th. So once applications close on the 7th, the judging period is going to begin. We're going to have judges review all those applications and announce 20 semi-finalists. Once the semi-finalists have been announced, the teams are going to have $1,000 and other resources to come up with a prototype or help kind of build out what they're going to present at the showcase on the 11th. So what you're being judged on essentially is kind of the progress that you've made to date since the start of the MIT academic year back in August. So since August to now, how much progress have you made to make your business viable? And once the judges kind of assess you and determine that your business is in fact viable, then you can attend a showcase and compete for the prize there on March 11th.
Let's see. Okay, can we ask for TA's emails? Let me just put that in. There's an email that goes to all of them.
Yes.
Nuts and bolts. I can't do this. Nuts and bolts. Nuts and bolts -ta at mit.edu. That's why we wanted you to be TA, see? How are we doing on questions here? If we give it a little more time. You're reminding me I haven't had dinner yet, so. Okay. Well, if we've gone through that, let's see. Let me just try this. How available will you and the TAs be after class? Send us an email and we'll let you know. That's the best way to do it. Okay, I'm going to just wrap things up then a little bit. Let me get this slide. And why is this not working? Come on. There we go. So the course is nuts and bolts. And so we've given you some nuts and bolts. There's a pile of them. And the question is, what are you going to do with them? What are you going to make? And we are interested in knowing that. So as you go forward, please circle back, let us know, because we've made improvements not only in the course, from feedback from people that are a year, 2, 5, 10 years later, but actually we want to know how we can help you succeed even better. So again, the people that have done all of this, the sole exceptions of the TAs who are getting paid virtually nothing, right? All the other people that have talked and presented on this have donated their time, and they've done it for a number of years. And they do it because in the entrepreneurial community, there's virtually no one who has had any success who doesn't realize somebody helped them along the way. And so there's a big give back component to that. And I would say in the future, as you succeed, please figure out, no matter where you are, Boston, in another country, just figure out how can you help another entrepreneur along. Because as you see, it's not easy, it's not obvious, it's a lifetime incurable disease, but you can do amazing things. So with that, I'm going to call it an end to the session. And unless we have any final reminders, people who are taking it for credit should fill out the form. And there are no any last minute points?
No, I hope everyone enjoyed the sessions, and we hope you all apply to the 100K competition, and best of luck.
Okay, and let's hope this pandemic is over sooner rather than later. This is getting tired. Okay, I'll have a great rest of the day, and success and cheerfulness no matter what you do. Take care now.